Hello everybody and welcome again to chesslecture.com. This is International Master David Vigorito, and today we're going to look at a topic that's not covered too frequently in chess literature, and we're going to look at something from one of my games that I played recently. That was a pretty important game for me, and what we're going to discuss is the calculation of variations, and this is going to just be in a very practical manner, and the issues I had to face in this game. And I think it's an instructive example because there's a lot of straight line calculation where there's not too many branches. You just have to decide what moves that you want to look at and kind of go from there and try to break them down. So we're picking up the action in a game where I was black on Black's 12th move, and so White is about to make his 13th move. So if we just kind of take a look at the position before we delve into it, see what's going on. It's even material, kind of an unclear position where White is castled and Black is almost launching an attack without too much development. Looks a lot like certain lines of the English attack in the Najdorf with knight g4. It did not arise from that, but a main difference is that the light squared bishops have been exchanged. It's not easy to say who this favors in a positional sense, but it is a difference. I would say, if anything, perhaps it favors Black just because the queen is pretty well placed on d7, protecting the knight on g4. So we start with White playing h3, the most natural move, and probably the best move. So this is kind of the first point where you have to make a decision with Black, and a lot of what calculation is decision making, which is very practical. You know, there's many times in a tournament game where you have to just kind of decide with your own best judgment what is the best course of action and try to assess the position. So the move that Black really wants to play here, which I did play, was h4. And the reason for that is if I play knight e5, he might even take the knight and aim for a position where I don't have attacking chances, and he can hope to maybe eventually use his queenside majority. This position's probably not too bad for Black, but I think White would probably have a pull. And one point is that the White knight can probably get to c4, where it will stand very well. Also, if I just retreat passively to f6, then e5 is going to be pretty annoying, because I really don't want to allow the center to open like this, where my king and my pieces look kind of silly. So the first move I really have to consider, and honestly it was really the only move that I calculated, was h4. So the first part of this is relatively simple. If the bishop goes to h2, I can take it, and if hg, White can emerge up a pawn if he wants with fg, but his pawns are a wreck. And after bishop g7, hitting b2, the bishop can go to e5, and Black has more than enough compensation. And if White takes with a queen, we get a similar situation. I'm not going to mate White on the h-file now, but my bishop will be very strong on g7. So that part was not too hard. Now, really what you have to calculate here after h4 is what will happen after bishop takes d6. A desperado, really grabbing a real pawn. So if you want, this is even a place, and there'll be several places, where you could even kind of pause the video and take a look at the position yourself. If I'm going too fast, you might want to think about the position for longer than I'm going to in the lecture. So after bishop takes d6, Black really only has one good option here, and that's a counter desperado. Knight takes f2. I could play e takes d6, hg, 8, and then h3 to try to get some counterplay if knight f2 failed. So after knight takes f2, this is also a position where I think you have to kind of take stock, and really here you should try to think what White would do in this position. Even though you're looking at it from Black's point of view, you have to be ready for certain things here, and white's best move apparently is kind of a surprise move. So what we can look at is king takes f2, e takes d6, and black should probably be doing all right here, because again the bishop can go to g7, it will be very strong where it hits b2, and can go to e5. It's not so easy for white to open up the position, and both kings are perhaps a little shaky, and e5 can be met by d5. So that part's not too difficult, but the real question is what happens after queen d4. And as an exercise here, I would definitely suggest you pause the video and kind of try to take stock of what's going on, even perhaps writing down your thoughts here, and then we can compare that to the game. Of course, you can check this position with a computer and see what's going on, but that doesn't really help anyone to help their calculation ability. And of course, during my game, I did not have the advantage of having a computer available. So white plays queen d4 and hits the knight on f2 and hits the rook on h8. So really I only considered one thing here, and it's really forced because I can't just allow white to just take everything. So what I played here was queen takes d6. Another good move which could transpose is knight takes h3. But after queen takes d6, the first point is if queen takes f2, I have a very pleasant choice between bishop g7, threatening bishop takes b2, and bishop d4, forcing c3, and now either bishop e5 with a very nice position, or even possibly g4, hg, h3, opening up white's king. White would have to play g3, but after bishop e5 it's still pretty unpleasant. Now, this still might have been white's best course of action. If white plays queen takes d6, I can throw in knight takes h3 check, gh, and e takes d6 with a pawn up and a better ending. Really, the reason I think perhaps it was better to play knight takes h3 first is it's very forcing, and after gh, queen d6, white either has to take the rook or trade queens into the bad ending. But it's probably a very pleasant choice for black. So I played queen takes d6, and now queen takes h8, and the knight is trapped, so really there's only one move to consider, and I had seen this, and it kind of helped me decide to go for it. So what I would like you to do here is take a look at knight takes h3, and pause the video and kind of take a look at white's three options in this position. And when you decide you think you know what's going on, or have a fair idea of how you would continue against all three continuations, that would be a good time to start the video again. So in the game I played knight takes h3. I should point out too that in this game a draw was not such a bad result for me. In fact, a draw would clinch clear first in the tournament. So having this in mind, I think helped me make the decision. Although we could also say from like an objective point of view, drawing the game with black is not so bad. But it definitely helped my decision making once I could decide that I thought knight takes h3 was worth at least a draw. So first of all, let's look at the move king f1 and see how this was calculated. This is probably the easiest move to refute because we can just play queen f4 check, and after king e2, we could take on e4, but there's really no need. We can just play queen to f2 check, and wherever the king goes, we will win easily. If king d3, queen takes e1, and if king d1, rook d8 check, king c1, queen f4 check. Remember this position, because I think this win here, kind of knowing this possibility, in a way confused me later, which I think happens sometimes when you're calculating a lot of lines. So just remember this position because I'll refer back to it. So king to f1 is very easy to refute. The king just walks out into the open, black's rook joins the attack, and the game is over. So the next move to calculate is king h1. The reason I am calculating these two moves first is they allow the knight to live, and it's very obvious that after gh, queen g3 check, we have at least a perpetual check. So because of that, I would like to calculate the other lines first. So king h1, and here it's funny, my opponent and I both saw similar things, but we didn't really see the strongest things. But we both saw knight f2 check, king g1. I also realized, of course, this is at least a draw because I can just keep, I can always play knight h3 check again. But I thought I would play like queen g3 here, threatening h3, or even queen g3 here, hitting the rook. But after king h1, knight f2 check, king g1, queen g3, something like rook e2, then h3, knight g4. I thought black must have a strong attack, but really the easiest thing to do is to just check again, play king g1 and knight g4. I think almost this is like an optical trick. The queen is threatening to go to h2 just as much from d6 as it is from g3, so there's really no need to throw in queen g3 first. And here white really has no defense to this like whirlwind attack where I'm going to check on h2 and h1 and take on g2. And keep in mind, because white did not capture the knight, I'm only down the exchange, not a rook. So it's much more easy to justify black's play. And in fact, knight g4 is just crushing. So those lines are not too difficult. So white played g takes h3. And after queen g3 check, king f1, I played queen f3 check, king g1, queen g3 check, king f1. And now I had an interesting dilemma, because as I mentioned, a draw was good enough for me here. So I had to make a real practical decision. I'm down a whole rook, so do I take the draw, or do I play for a win? And, I kind of thought, I kind of want to win this game, but you also don't want to do anything crazy and lose, especially as a draw would clinch first place for me. What I decided was that the attack would be worth at least a draw, and I could probably bail out in a couple moves with a perpetual check if necessary. And that assessment was correct, but I could have given myself some scary moments. So I played queen takes h3 check, king e2, and already it seems I made a little mistake here. It might have been best to play rook d8 right away, cutting off the king, or even castles. This is also a point that I will keep coming back to. There were many positions where I had to decide if I wanted to castle or play rook at d8. The basic tactical ideas that will revolve around that are, if I castle after a typical defensive move for white here to bring the queen back into play, queen c3, the threat to the pawn on c6 with check is not going to be a perpetual check, but there'll be a lot of checks for white in this position. Whereas if I play rook d8, queen c3 will threaten a perpetual check, because I would have to play like rook d7, queen c8. This is assuming I check again with my queen. Also, if I castle, the bishop on g7 will be protected, but I won't be able to lift my rook so easily to, say, d6 to try to attack, because the bishop on f8 will be hanging. If I play rook d8, I won't have that issue, but the bishop will be pinned. So, kind of interesting trade-off. In fact, both moves win. rook d8 or castles, I think I just did not do the most accurate thing. What I played instead was queen g2 check. I'm sorry, I played queen g4 check, king e3, queen f4 check, king d3, and I had seen that the king was not going to get away because I can play queen to g3 check. I didn't really want to play like rook d8 because then the king goes to c4, and I thought even if I still have a strong attack, I'm down a rook, and I don't really like chasing the king to the relatively safe queen side. So I play queen g3 check, king e2, and now all I've done is change the position of my queen from h3 to g3. I kind of like g3 a little better. It's closer to the king, covers more squares near the king, and it also keeps an eye on the rook on e1. That's why white had to go back right away. And now I think I made a mistake. I played queen g2 check. Here too, like castles or rook d8, I think win very quickly. Perhaps I just wasn't ready to make a quiet move, and I thought I'll make another check. But rook d8 is the best move. Really, white will have nothing better than queen c3, and then after queen g2 check, king e3 will transpose to the game. The reason that this is not such a good move to play queen g2 is that white actually has some kind of defense here. And my opponent and I both missed it. I think we both just assumed that if the king goes to the d file, the rook check will win. And it's true in the case of king d3, because after rook d8 check, king c4, with my queen on g2 instead of g4, I have queen takes c2 check, knight c3, queen d3 check, king b3, rook b8 check, and if king a4, queen a6 is mate, and king a3, queen a6 check, knight a4, and then a funny e6 check, and white will have to give up his queen or be quickly mated. The illusion my opponent and I both had was that the king could not go to d1, which is actually the best move. It was probably just based on an assumption that rook d8 was mating, but it's not really the case, because after rook d8 check, king c1, I don't have the move queen f4 check, which I alluded to earlier in that other line when I was checking on g4. So this is not so easy, and this, I think, even though black is still the one pushing, I think this would have really freaked me out because I'm down a rook. The truth is, after queen f2, it's not easy for white to defend. If he plays queen to c3, I have this little deflection. Bishop g7, he can't take it because of queen takes e1 mate. And if he plays e5, I suddenly have g4 with the threat bishop h6 check, and this idea will come up again. And another important point of bishop g7 is queen takes c6 check, there's no perp now, I just go to g7, and white cannot really develop. And if queen to e3, I can actually trade queens. Queen takes e3, rook takes e3, g4, threatening bishop h6. White has so much trouble getting his pieces out that this is still better for black, even if it's not as simple as mating white as I could have done in the game. For example, after knight d2, bishop h6, rook d3, h3, white has to start running his king over. King d1, rook d3, cd3, h2, king e2, bishop takes d2, and if white takes the bishop, then I will play g3 and g2, so white's forced to just try to stop the pawns, but black has very good winning chances down the exchange with these connected pass pawns. So this I did not calculate during the game, I found it later. Instead of queen c3, white can probably play rook d1, rook takes d1, king takes d1, g4, queen c3, and with the idea of playing maybe queen e1 to try to defend, and probably black has to look for a perpetual check, and probably has it. So I think that at that point, white could have gone into that line and probably drawn the game. So I made a couple mistakes with the checks. But as we see, I think my decision was correct, because really black is not risking much in the game. So in the game, he made a mistake. He played king e3. And here, I can also take the perpetual, which is why I went into this. Or I can castle or play rook d8. I think both moves are probably about equivalent. I chose rook d8. I just felt like my king was a little more secure on e8, and I wasn't worried so much about the bishop being pinned on f8, because I was thinking white's going to have to retreat the queen anyway. So I play rook d8, and the real threat here is g4. So if white just tries to develop something, you know, say try like knight e3, even if queen d2 check doesn't work, knight a3 or knight c3, g4 threatening queen f3 mate is very strong. And I had also seen that something like queen e5, g4, queen f4, bishop h6 still works, threatening queen f3 mate again. So white played queen to c3. And here I think I made a practical mistake. I probably should have thrown in a couple checks to repeat the position. It was very unusual time control. It was a 30-move time control. But the situation was this. I had maybe 20 minutes to my opponent's 5 minutes. And at this point we're around move 26 or 27. And I was thinking the position might actually be a draw, but I shouldn't repeat because I wanted to keep my opponent in time pressure. Really both assumptions were wrong, because the position is winning for black, and I was the one that ended up needing the time to find a win. So I really should have thrown in a couple checks here just to make it to time control. But what I did instead was I played what is really the correct move, but I just didn't leave myself time for the follow-up. I played the calm rook d6, protecting c6. This also would have worked if my king was on c8. And once again, there's a devastating threat of g4, followed by bishop h6 bishop h6 check. So if he plays knight d2, just g4, and there's no defense to bishop h6. Unfortunately for me, my opponent played the best move very quickly. He played e5, which is losing, but it's probably the best practical try. And now, something kind of strange happened. I played queen g3 check, king e2, queen g2 check, king e3. And I started calculating one line, and I couldn't make it work, so I threw in a check again. And here white, now that we've made time control, could have actually claimed a draw with king e3. Instead he moved. It's actually kind of a common mistake. I was surprised, and in hindsight I was very surprised, because I played my opponent a few months before in a tournament where he actually did claim a draw by threefold repetition. So he was certainly familiar with the rule, but both low on time, it happened. So this had a nice benefit for me. Now it was time control, and I could take quite a bit of time to try to figure it out. So this is a real key position where I strongly recommend you pause the video and make a list of all the different candidate moves you would play here. Of course, black can take a draw with queen g3 check, but really this is a position for calculation where you have to make a list of candidate moves, because it's very sharp, but you're down a rook. So in order to really decide if you're going to take the draw, you have to make a list of the possible moves that you're going to consider, even if they seem ridiculous. I mean, maybe you're not going to play queen e2 check and give away the queen, so it doesn't have to be every legal move, but you want to make a list of moves that you should at least consider, however briefly. So make this list and pause the video, and then we will look at all the different candidate moves I looked at in turn, and you can see how those match up and how they match up to the truth. So when I reached this position, I had a very large list of candidate moves. I can move the rook to e6 or d5 or d7 or d8. I can play bishop g7, pinning the pawn to the queen. I can play g4, threatening bishop h6 check, or a very funny move, which I considered, is even f5. So let's look at f5 first, because it's kind of silly. Threatens f4 mate, but after e takes d6, white's king will run away in the light squares. And this is really a key issue in the position, is if white's king can escape to the queen side, we might overstep our draw, which we have for the taking. And it's very similar with rook e6. The king has a very good chance of escaping via d3. Keep in mind, if like the king goes to d3 and we do queen d5, usually white will be able to play queen d4. Now, f5 and rook e6 don't really seem to work too well. So let's look at a couple of the most obvious moves. One is bishop g7. And this move probably is a winning move. And white can take the rook, and probably should. And then after bishop c3, knight c3, black probably still has a winning position. Can make a lot of checks, probably pick up the pawn on d6. I avoided this position because I thought, even though it's probably much better for black with the queen and the pawn armada, I guess I thought that this position was losable, in the sense that if I mess up my coordination, two rooks and a knight is a lot of material to kind of harass my king with. So if you decided that this move was the move you would want to play, don't be too upset with yourself, because it probably is a winning move. The move I really wanted to play is g4. And this is a case too where if you want you can pause the video, because there's quite a bit to calculate here. And this is the move I spent almost all of my time on. And it was this move that I was so focused on that this is where I burned up my time and ended up having to repeat and allow the draw claim. But pause this video and then see what you conclude about this move. So if black plays g4, the threat is both queen f3 mate and bishop to h6 mate. So white has to play e takes d6. And now there's two lines to calculate. The most obvious is bishop h6 check. Now the king can't go to d4 because queen d5 is mate. So white has to play king d3. And well, you can't play queen d5 check because the king can go to e2 and start to escape. So we would have to play queen f3 check, king c4, queen d5 check, king b4, queen b5 check, king a3. I must have looked at this position in my head 10 times when I was calculating, because it felt right, but unfortunately it doesn't work. There's not even a draw after queen a6, king b3, queen b5, queen b4. So that does not work. The alternative is to check on f3 first with queen f3 check. But here, there's a very unfortunate line after king d2, bishop h6 check, rook e3. At first it looks like, oh, black will win the rook back. One of the rooks. This is the problem. I'm down two rooks now. King d1, bishop e3. And it looks like it might be some trouble for white. But unfortunately, this queen takes c6 check, king f8, and at the very least, this queen c8, king g7, queen takes g4 check. And white can always take on e7 and play queen e2 to defend. Queen e2 first, and only take on e7 if it's check. So it all seems very simple in hindsight to me now, but at the time I guess I felt like intuitively g4 should be correct, but the main tactical defect in playing g4 is that after taking the rook on d6, black's control of d3 disappears. So what does that leave us with for candidate moves? One move I looked at was rook d5, which looks very funny, kind of hanging the c-pawn. And I'm really not sure what's going on after queen takes c6 check, d8, queen a8 check. And during the game, my idea was to play like king to d7, queen b7 check, king e6, queen c6 check, and king takes e5. But I guess I just thought after something like knight c3, I really wasn't so sure what was going on. And it's very dangerous to, I think, play like a long line like this with so many checks if you don't really see what the outcome is. It's not so easy to mate white. And rook d3 check, which looks like it nicely wins the queen, meets king takes d3 check, and it is black that is losing all of his pieces. So I kind of went by the saying long variation, wrong variation, I think is like an old saying of Larson's. So if you've looked at this position, I wonder if anyone has managed to find the win here just by using the candidate moves. In fact, I was able to do so now that I have made time control. So if you want one more chance to figure it out, again, pause the video. Otherwise, I'm moving on. The winning move is rook to d8. Rook d7 is also very strong. But after rook d8, what it took me a while to appreciate was that there's still no defense to g4 and bishop h6 check. And if in some ways this seems obvious if we go back, because when I played rook d6, it didn't really make a direct threat. It looks like the rook maybe is going to slide along the third rank, but that's not really the case. Really, I'm just threatening g4 and bishop h6 check. So after e5, and I threw in these checks, it took me a long time to realize that rook d8, I still have the same threat, and the queen on g2 protects c6, which I was well aware of. I just didn't think that down a rook I could lose the time. And I think white's only real defense here is to play, it's not really much of a defense, but to just play something like queen d2, rook takes d2, knight takes d2, and then I play g4. And I have a queen for 2 rooks, but I have all these pawns, and I still have a raging attack with bishop h6. And the only reason I chose rook d8 instead of rook d7 was I realized that queen takes c6 is never going to be check. He just doesn't have time to do it. And that if I do rook d7, I thought, well, he can at least throw in e6, fe, and then give away his queen. And it's probably a trivial point, but I just decided that in this position I would rather have my pawns intact, thinking I could win the e-pawn. So after rook d8, queen d2 is losing, but it's really the only chance left. What my opponent did instead was he still tried e6, and then I found a clever move, f5, and in addition to g4, I'm threatening the immediate f4 mate, to which there's not really a defense. One other point I should mention when I chose rook d8 was I'd seen that this funny move, rook f1, trying to defend. If I do queen takes f1, he actually has a perp on c6, but I realized that I could still just ignore the rook and play g4 with a threat of bishop h6 check. So after rook d8, e6, f5, there's just no defense left, and white had to resign. It was very interesting because neither piece for white on the queen side, the knight on b1 and rook on a1 developed. And my f8 bishop never developed, although it was still a very strong part of the attack, even though it never really threatened anything immediately. But there was always a threaten to mate with it, and it was very strong. So I think I learned a lot from this game, just regarding kind of practicality of throwing in checks. I think, in general, I would say if you think you're probably winning or better, you should repeat to get to the time control, even if maybe time is even or you're a little ahead on time. If you think you have to swindle and you're worse, then you're better off just leaving your opponent in time pressure. And really I just guessed, and I guessed wrong. But also very good example in this position after e5. of drawing up a list of candidate moves. And perhaps I would have found the solution more quickly and not had to accidentally allow this threefold repetition if I hadn't been so obsessed with the move g4 and I had said, let me make a list first, look at g4. I dismissed a couple of the moves quickly, but at first the retreats rook d8 and rook d7 were not even on my list of candidate moves. It was only when I had more time and realized g4 did not work and I was close to resigning myself to a draw that I started making another list of candidate moves. And once I found rook d8 or rook d7, I very quickly realized that there was no defense. Sometimes that happens. You spend 20 minutes calculating nonsense, and then suddenly you spot another move and very quickly either play it, sometimes mistakenly, but very quickly play it and realize it was right. And that was the case here. I probably spent 20 minutes on rook d8, but once I saw it, I only needed a minute to see that it was an easy win. So hope you learned something and enjoyed this lecture, and we will see you next time at chesslecture.com.